So what is the key to mastering the art of communication? Or maybe just to say, what is the key to communication? Do you remember what we said in the last video? The key to communication is to commune, or better said, to connect, right? Like, you can't communicate with another person if they're not listening to you. You can't communicate with another person if they don't understand the language you're speaking. You can't understand to another person if they don't really grasp the analogy you're using. In other words, there's this whole world of connection that precedes the content of what you're saying. If you're not connected to the other person, it doesn't matter what you're saying because they're not going to get it. And if they don't get it, there was no communication. So communication is not about the speaker. It's not about what you're saying. It's about the listener. It's about what they're hearing. And so that's an important insight for us to now expand. What I want to talk about in this second video in the series is I want to talk about what stands between you and other people that stops you from connecting. And what we can call that is something called a listening filter, right? And like, you know, from your own experience that when we hear people talk, we filter it in a certain way. Like, we add meaning to what people are saying, to their tone of voice, to their expression, their nonverbal cues. So, for example, in the last video, I talked about a personal story and a business story. And in the personal story, there was a guy named Matthew working on his computer, and he's working all day trying to get something done. By the end of the day, email it out. And meanwhile, his wife is coming in. Let's call her Stacy, and she's got grocery bags, and she's struggling to come through the door. And she just hung up the phone with somebody, and he can't quite get to her. And he says, "Hey, babe, how you doing?" And she goes, "Fine." And the way she said, there's a certain tone, right? And what happens is Matthew, his listening filter, interprets the tone of voice of what Stacy's saying. And so he starts to think, oh, geez, what did I do wrong? Like, I'm working my butt off here. Like, why is she angry with me? I want to help her. I can't. And so he starts to get into an upset because he has this experience. He judges that she is actually angry with him. Meanwhile, that's not what's happening at all. I'll tell you in a second what was happening for Stacy. But let's finish the idea of the interpretation filter or the listening filter for Matthew. So the listening filter is built on 3 points: judgment, story, point of view. So, for example, Matthew is judging that she's angry with him, which she's really not. We'll find out in a second. And then he's judging, like, I did something wrong. He starts to tell himself an internal story, an internal narrative, right? And you remember what this means. You may have heard of it before. In life, there's an event, and then there's the story we tell ourselves about the event that gives it meaning, right? Somebody shows up late to a movie. You're waiting at the movie theater. You're like, what's going on? Did they get in an accident? They must have got in an accident. And they didn't. There was traffic, right? But what's happening is they're late, but the story you tell is they got in an accident. And remember, it's the story you tell that gives you your reaction. So what's happening for Matthew is he's telling himself a story. Stacy's pissed off at me. Oh, now she's really got a problem. Why is it my fault? And so he starts to react to the meaning he put on her communication. He's in connection with his filter. He's not in connection with his wife. And that's going to create an impossibility for them to communicate until he gets that filter out of the way. He gets through it. Also, the filter is built on point of view: judgment, story, point of view. If Matthew's only coming from his point of view, he won't be able to get into her world. So he won't be able to connect with her. He's only over here with himself. The key to connection is to actually get out of your point of view and to step over there into the other person's point of view. And you'll notice this if you've ever spoken in front of audiences or if you've talked in front of a team. You know, when you're only coming from your perspective, it's you can't tell if the other person's getting it. But if you try to listen to how the other person's hearing you, how they're listening to you, you put yourself in the other person's world, you start to notice that there's this natural connection, this synchronicity, this vibe, this human connection that happens. Because why? Because you've gone around your filter because your attention is on how is the other person hearing me. Remember, communication is not about what the speaker's saying. It's about what the